Today we pick up with changes in Europe, and we're going to be looking at how things were exchanged around the globe, around the world. So we're going to look at Columbus, because that's probably who we're most familiar with. So when Columbus came home from the Americas, he brought back with him plants and animals and the people that he encountered on his voyages. When he goes back to the Americas, because he makes several trips, but when he goes back to the Americas, he's going to take European things with him. And so this exchange of goods across the ocean is called the Columbian Exchange. And so that's how we get new foods that are going to be introduced both in Europe as well as in the Americas. So, for example, from the Americas, Christopher Columbus took with him things like tomatoes and sweet potatoes and pumpkins and squash and beans and pineapple and peppers and tobacco and chocolate and corn and potatoes, all kinds of stuff. And from Europe, he brought over to the Americas things like wheat and melons, grapes, bananas, coconut palms, coffee, sugar cane, cattle, pigs, goats, chickens, horses, donkeys. So from this exchange, we see a large introduction of new goods to both locations, both places, both Europe and the Americas. So it's going to have a huge impact on both societies. But it also has an impact on the population as well. But it's going to take time for that impact to be seen. But it does contribute to the population growth with some other factors like better medicine and better care of wounds and all that kind of stuff as well. But because the people are beginning to have a growth in their population, places get overcrowded, and so they begin to migrate to places where it's less crowded, or perhaps they could find a job. And so the migration of these people, they also take with them their ideas, and so we get millions of settlers who are going to come to the Americas, come to Africa, come to Asia. The Africans were brought forcibly over to the Americas, and Native American populations are going to suffer from this new influx of people coming in because of war, but also because of the new diseases they brought with them. That's going to expose them to those to dangers to their health. Because of the massive amounts of people that are being born, the population growth, we also are going to see a change in the economy, because now things are going to have to be done differently than they had been previous. And so it's called the Commercial Revolution. The conquest of the Americas and the increased trade that comes with it is going to make a dramatic economic change. We see an increase in prices and competition, and so modern capitalism is going to be introduced during this time period. That includes things like a price revolution, and the price revolution comes about because of inflation. Inflation is a rise in prices that is linked to an increase in the amount of money that's available, the amount of money that can be spent. And so since there was this increase in the population, that's going to cause inflation, because there's more people with more money that can be spent. The demand for goods and services will increase, and the goods and services, however, were scarce. They weren't keeping up, and so sellers can increase their prices as a result, because people will pay more when it's something that's not readily available. So a lot of the monarchies, a lot of the governments will make the decision to increase the flow of silver and gold. That if people have more money, they can spend more money, and that will generate more jobs and all that kind of stuff. So an increase in the money supply is going to increase the value of, or increase the prices. And so that leads into this growth of capitalism. Capitalism is where you make investments in businesses, or you make an investment in a product to try and make a profit. And you're competing for that profit. And during this time period, we're going to see the introduction of entrepreneurs. And an entrepreneur is a merchant who is trying to organize and assume the risks of the business. But there's some sort of enterprising. They're doing it in a new way. They're doing it in something that is innovative way. And so many of them are capitalist entrepreneurs, and they're doing it to compete with those businesses that are very successful. And so these capitalist investors are more willing to take risks because they think that they'll get a higher payout in the end. And so they're going to introduce some new business practices to the economy. For example, they're going to introduce this idea of the joint stock company. And a joint stock company is going to allow people to pool together large amounts of capital, and capital's money or resources. So it allows these people to pool together large amounts of their capital that they needed for overseas ventures, to send out ships to go bring back spices. Very risky, not always successful, but if they came back with spices and goods from Asia and India, you're going to make a ton of money. So the risk was seen as being worth it in the end. So these joint stock companies are created to help in those ventures. Great example is one couple that we've already talked about, the East India companies, the French East India, the British East India, and the Dutch East India companies. Those are all joint stock companies where it's a bunch of people going together to try and make a profit. Highly risky, but they do make profits off of it. So these joint stock companies are a way to bypass the guilds. Remember, the guilds were they came about in the Middle Ages, and people who were of the same job banded together, and they controlled the quality, and they controlled the prices, and they controlled who could become a master guildsman, who could even enter into the guild. So they were in control of a lot of the production. They controlled the manufacture of these goods. They had strict rules about pricing and working conditions and quality. But the capitalists are going to get around that system, because if you had a joint stock company, it wasn't going to work very well with the guilds, because they see that as competition and they don't want that. And so they're going to discourage people from joining in. So the capitalists get around it by doing something called the putting out system. And the putting out system is a system where you are going to put out your resources to where they're going to be best utilized. So let me explain that. For example, let's say you're an investor, you're a capitalist who wants to invest in the clothing industry or the textile industry. Well, what you would do is that you would go to the farm, the local farms, and you would buy the raw wool that came right off the sheep, that was just shorn off the sheep. And you would send it to the peasant villagers. You're not going to bring it back to the city and have a factory work on it, because factories are mostly controlled by the guilds. So you're going to send it out to these peasant villages, because in the peasant villages, the poor people, for the most part, had to know how to do a little bit of everything. And so there were women in the peasant villages who knew how to make this raw wool into cloth. And then the merchants would buy the cloth, and then they would send it to the city to get it dyed and to have it finished so it was like a softer material or a nicer, a finer material. And then they're going to sell that finished product for a profit, because they were able to cut out the middlemen of the guild who would make it into cloth. They could pay the peasant women a lot less money. And so it's going to separate capital from labor for the first time in European history, that the money and the money invested is going to be separated from the labor that is creating it. So kind of an interesting thing. From there, we get some new economic policies that are going to come into play. The first is mercantilism. And mercantilism is where a nation is looking to export more than it imports, which only makes sense, because if you export, you're making money because you're selling stuff to other people. If you import, you are buying things, and so you're not making money off of that. So mercantilism is going to have a lot to do with, again, this exploration of Asia and Africa and India, because the European nations are going to look and create from these areas colonies. Now, the role of the colonies is that they are there to exist for the benefit of the parent country. That's what their job is to make money for the parent country. So they would provide resources and raw materials, things that had been underutilized by the people of that colony before the Europeans got there. And so they ship all the raw goods and materials back to Europe, where they are then made into something. And then the Europeans, being pretty smart business people, are going to turn around and sell that to these colonies. They're going to say, oh, well, we used your wood in order to make this chair. You have to buy the chair from us, because that's the only way you're going to get a chair. You can't buy it from anybody else who could maybe sell it for less. And so these colonies not only provided resources, but they also serve as a market for the manufactured goods that came back from their own resources that they sent out, which is kind of a sad thing. But most of the colonies had very strict laws that the colonies could not have their own industry. They couldn't make their own chairs. They had to buy it from their parent country. And they couldn't buy it from another country, another European country. They had to buy it from the country that owned them as a colony. Well, for the Europeans, this is a good deal because it's going to increase their national wealth. They make tons of money off of this. Because of that, they're going to be able to do a lot of things within their country, like clearing up wasteland and draining swamps and building roads and canals, all kinds of stuff that they're able to make money off of this. They're also able to sell those products to other people who are interested in those products. So if you have this wooden chair, they're able to sell it to the Americas as well. And they are then able to collect money on anything that is brought into their country as competition by placing tariffs on them. And a tariff is a tax on an imported good. Things that are coming into your country, you're going to put a tax on it so it's more expensive. The idea is to protect your native industries from foreign competition. So if France is taking stuff from an African colony and making it into, let's go with the same thing of chairs, and the British are doing the same thing with their wood that they're getting from India, then what's going to happen is that the British are going to try to sell to the French, or the French are going to try and sell to the British their chairs that they're having made. Well, the French don't want to buy the British because that only makes money for the British chair, or for the British government. They don't want to buy the British chair. So with the British chair coming in, they're going to raise the price on it. They're going to add a tariff. And so people are going to be more encouraged, the people of France are going to be more encouraged to buy the French chair rather than the British chair. So hopefully that all makes sense. Well, the ordinary lives of people are also going to be changed as well as a result of this interaction with foreign areas, and as well as with the price revolution. The nobles are going to be hurt by the price revolution because they didn't have a whole lot of cash on hand. Their wealth was in their land, in their property. And so as a result, they're going to have trouble, a lot of trouble, getting actual cash for things like clothes and food and luxury goods. And so they begin to sell off their land in order to make some cash. Well, that's going to reduce their income because now they're not going to have nearly as much rent coming in or crops that they can sell because they're selling off their land. So the price revolution actually is going to hurt them quite a bit. The peasants, most Europeans were still peasants at this time, so they're not making just a ton of money, and they're going to continue to struggle. What really doesn't help them out is the fact that they are very slow to change. Change is going to be very slow to come to most of the peasants of Europe. For example, potatoes were introduced with Christopher Columbus in the 1500s. But the German population isn't going to grow potatoes until the late 1700s. And potatoes are a fairly easy crop to grow, and it's a staple of your diet. It can replace a lot of other vegetables. It's a more filling vegetable, but the Germans don't want to. It was available to them as early as the 1500s, but they're so bound up in their tradition that nobody around me grows potatoes. I'm not going to start. I'm not going to change it. I'm going to grow what my fathers and my grandfathers and my great-grandfathers have always grown. And so they didn't make these changes that could actually help them out. They could make money by selling potatoes because you could get more of them than you could some other vegetables. And so you could keep some for your family, but you could also sell off the surplus and make some money off of it. But they don't. The cities are also going to be impacted as well. Merchants and guilds are going to remain very powerful in the cities. And lawyers are going to gain importance as well, as contracts are being made by these joint stock companies of who invested what and what are you responsible for. In the cities, the middle class lead a pretty comfortable life. They have nice homes, they have nice clothing, they typically had servants that serve them. And your middle classes, a lot of the times, are going to, actually, for us, by our standards, they'd be fairly rich for the middle class. But they weren't the nobility, so they didn't have a whole lot of power. At the bottom in the cities were your journeymen and your laborers, people who were working in the factories, people who were working for the guilds, and they were often on the edge of poverty. Now, the families of this time period, the noble households, prior to this, in noble households, you would have like your extended family living with you. So you might be the duke of something, and you would have your wife and your children living with you, but you might also have an aunt and an uncle, or cousins, and your extended family coming to live with you in your household. But because they get strapped for cash, those noble households are going to grow smaller. They're going to have less extended family connections just because they couldn't afford to anymore. In the middle class, like I said, the middle class today, we kind of consider them to be somewhat upper class because of how they lived. In the middle class, they would plan their children's education, of what jobs and what education they needed to have in order to be successful and carry on the family business. They'd also plan their career, and a lot of times they also still chose who they were going to get married to. They always considered what their financial or social advantages might be for doing this. Women in this time period, the family, like I said, is still very much centered around the patriarchal, which means it's father-based, that the father was in charge. But the women's chief role in the family was to be a wife and a mother. And so there were certain virtues that were looked for, like modesty, which is like not being too showy, that you're modest, that you don't brag about yourself. Household economy was another virtue, and household economy just means that she isn't spending money left and right. She knows how to save, she knows how to find a good deal. And other virtues included obedience and caring. The marriage age is going to increase, finally, during this time period. In the Middle Ages, if you remember, girls typically got married at the age of 12, and boys typically were married for the first time at the age of 14. And that was so that they could produce as many children as possible, because a lot of kids didn't survive in the Middle Ages. But by 1500, women, the marriage age is going to get pushed back to the mid to late 20s for both men and women. And so this is a testament to the amount of medicine that was available, but also the fact that there's less people dying as a result. We'll also see an increase in the number of women who stay single. About 20% will remain single, and women had almost no legal or property rights until after the 1600s. And so it's going to be a very slow growth, but we do see some growth that way. So throughout the 15 and the 1600s, Europe is going to emerge as this powerful force. Kind of went through some dark times in the Middle Ages, and then in the Renaissance they start to really turn things around. But the exploration of the rest of the world by the Europeans is going to lead to the European domination. And that's because of the goods that are exchanged and their exposure to new cultures and beliefs. They take what they consider to be the best from everybody else and incorporate it in their own culture.